Welcome to Intention Radio, a content-driven station aimed at uplifting your soul, igniting your heart, and inspiring every molecule of your body. You'll want to tune in to this transformational platform every day of the week at www.intentionradio.com. Taking a deep breath, sit back, relax, and enjoy the show.
Hi, I am Cyber Riva, your co-host, the new and improved version of Cyber Gina here on the Doc Speaks show on Intention Radio, coming to you from deep in cyberspace. Now here is your voice of cyber intelligence from deep in cyberspace, your host and mine, Doc.
Thank you, Cyber Riva, for that wonderful introduction. And this is the Doc Speak Show on Intention Radio and also on YouTube. And I'm the Doc, a voice that comes to you from the internet wilderness, deep in cyberspace. And today we're going to be looking at chapter 18 of Revelations, where we're going to be dealing with the Lament of Babylon. And this is where a lot of my so-called colleagues of theology make a large mistake. I mean, up until now, and we've looked at 18 chapters of Revelation, and what we've noticed is that there is no reference whatsoever to any kind of a physical rapture up to heaven like Enoch or Elijah. That has not taken place. In fact, in the harvest, we see that two groups were cut away from the root of their plant, which, as I mentioned in that show, signifies the spirit being removed from the body. The other interesting thing that we noticed is the term swept away. Now, the word swept away is used at least 3 times in Scripture, meaning they died. In fact, the very verses that they want to use for the rapture comes a sentence after, or a verse after, the phrase swept away. And that's from Matthew 40, but they fail to read 39, and I mentioned that as well. So we have this understanding that that did not take place. The next thing that we often hear, and the YouTubes are loaded with this, is that the Roman Catholic Church is the Harlot of Babylon. And that is also far from the truth, since 18 chapters so far, and there's really no indication of Rome being that character. Now, they will say, well, Rome is built on 7 hills, and I will tell you that there are more than 14 cities on the globe that are built on 7 hills. And that includes Jerusalem, Babylon, and Istanbul. So which one of those are you talking about? Now, so if you're going to use a reference of 7 hills, that's not enough detail. That's like saying we have a suspect who was wearing a trench coat coming out of the bank. Well, how many people own a trench coat? Lots. We have an identity that the person was white. How many people are white? Or we have an identity that the person was black. Well, how many people are black? You know, a black man in a trench coat or a white man in a trench coat. That's not enough evidence. So neither is Seven Hills, because New York City is also built on Seven Hills. And when we look at today's topic, the Lamenting of Babylon, New York City would fit the character a lot more than the city of Rome. And that's what we're going to be looking at today. Because we're going to skip over in chapter 18, and we're going to go to verse 11, because this is where the key is that people want to miss, they don't want to use to describe because they already have a bias. The merchants of the earth will weep and mourn over her because no one buys their cargoes anymore. Cargoes of gold, silver, precious stones, and pearls, fine linen, purple silk, scarlet cloth, every sort of articles of every kind made of ivory, costly wood, bronze, iron, and marble, cargoes of cinnamon and spice, of incense, myrrh, frankincense, of wine, olive oil, fine flour, and wheat, cattle, and sheep, horses, carriages, and human beings sold as slaves. There's an interesting one, sold as slaves. The Roman Catholic Church has never, ever sold slaves. So right there you got a problem, if you want to say Roman Catholic Church. The other interesting thing is that the Roman Catholic Church doesn't make any of those goods for them to buy from, nor the other way around. So we have something here that is contrary to any belief that the Roman Catholic Church is the harlot of Babylon or Babylon the Great, because merchants have to do business with her in a buying and selling situation. The church doesn't manufacture anything. The church is not a place of selling. Now, we're also looking at that this was written nearly 2,000 years ago, and I'm sure that when John saw this, God didn't give him a vision of the New York Stock Exchange, that he saw it in a different way, like in a marketplace, like in an ancient time, in a marketplace where all these things are sold, because a marketplace in ancient times would be the symbol for the stock market. Ooh, interesting. Where they bring their stocks, their goods, to market. So now, it would have to be someplace where goods are sold. And that's in a city, and that's generally in a city. Now, we saw slaves. I'm sure that people are buying slaves in Istanbul today because Muslims have been selling slaves since Muhammad. And that's 1,300 years. They're selling them today. They're the ones that would buy blacks from other blacks and then sold them on a market. You see, so I often wonder why black people want to become Muslims when they're the ones doing the selling. And in fact, in Africa, they have 30 million slaves today, between what's going on with the Muslims and the communities in Africa. So it's not the church that's selling slaves, but it's not also the church doesn't do any of those other sales. But who does? The stock market. So now, where are the major stock markets? Well, obviously New York City has the stock market, okay? But we also have one in London. Now, when John was writing this, there was none in London and there was none in New York City. and there was probably none in China or Japan or anywhere else in the world. So he's looking at a picture of a marketplace in a city like the old times, where everybody had their stations, their little outdoor tents and whatnot, where they would sell their goods. Today, it's in a high-rise buildings where commodities are sold through a network. Now, it's my understanding that Israel did not establish a stock market until around 1953. Also, we have Israel has returned. And we used that phrase once before because, again, they want to use it for Rome. But when John was writing this, and I mentioned this before, Rome was not a past tense empire. It was a present empire. So to use the phrase once was, is not, and will come cannot be applied to Rome, because at the time of the writing, Rome is. However, Israel is not at the time of the writing. In fact, there wasn't even a temple at the time of the writing. And come again. And it did. So here we are in the second millennium, 2016, and Jerusalem is there, Israel is there, and they have a stock market. It's in Tel Aviv, and I think there might be hints of putting one in there might be one in Jerusalem, but the major one is in Tel Aviv right now. But that's part of Israel. So Israel has a stock market. Now, the other interesting thing is this. If the market in Tel Aviv was to fall entirely, that would collapse London, and then it would collapse New York, because it would be a chain reaction, because they're all tied together. So if all the stocks fold in Tel Aviv, they all fold in London. They all fall in New York. So would the merchants of the world lament? Of course they would. They just went bankrupt. They all went bankrupt. And interesting enough is that the richest family in the world, a Jewish family, lives in England. The Rothschild family is worth $500 trillion, which means they could pay off the debt of every single nation in the world and still be multi-billionaires. Talk about greed. Okay? That's greed on a first-hand scale. Because indirectly, this person wants to be king of the world. And he obviously is, because he can buy and sell anyone, anytime. He works behind the scenes. So we have someone who's controlling these world markets, and he does because he controls the banks. And who controls the banks? The same group of people. Goldman and Sachs. They're not Italian. They're not Japanese. They're not Brazilian. Okay? They control the money of the world. So when we look at it, it's not a religious group that is being referred to in chapters 17 and 18. It's a economic nation that we're looking at. Not a church of any kind. It's an economic structure which is part of a government, a state, meaning a nation. So if the markets were to collapse, who would lament? Everybody who has stocks in the stock market would go broke. Everyone in business would go broke. Everyone who has stocks, including some senior citizen who has a few little dollars, would go broke. Now, the other interesting thing here is what we're seeing is, and I would like to refer to it as folding back, that the Bible, God, the author of a saga, a drama, has written it so that the end mirrors the beginning. Because when you take a book, the front page is a reflection of the back page. So we have a reflection. So now what are we going to see? We're going to be looking at the fact that the end will mirror the beginning. And in some cases, the roles are going to be reversed. We're going to see a little bit of irony here. And another interesting thing that my fellow theologians don't seem to understand, that the Bible is a book, and a book tells a story. So when you read a book, you have to know how to read. And there's certain characteristics in a book that you should know about. And those are the protagonist, antagonist, the nemesis, the theme, the plot. These are the characteristics of the story. And there's characters in the story. But in this particular story, sometimes cities and nations are viewed as a person. So we need to look at that from the standpoint of a book also. So keep that in mind, that we need to have that type of understanding as we're reading the book. Because what we're going to see is some interesting character developments here that will relate to the story. See, in the beginning of the story, because that's where we're going to get the reflection. And in an essay, if any of you know how to read or write an essay, you know that in the beginning you have a hook and you present the problem of the essay. And then in the end, you've come to some resolution and you restate the problem and the conclusion. So they mirror one another. Well, so does the Bible. In the beginning, we have a nemesis, an antagonist. And we have a couple who are the protagonists in the story. And we also have God, who's another main character in the story. And what happens in the story is that the nemesis gets the female, the future harlot, to rebel. And she causes her husband to rebel, the people. So we now have a nation, Adam's offspring. The nation has rebelled because of the harlot who was influenced by the nemesis, the antagonist in the story. And as we move through the story, we see some of that happening again. We have behind the scenes of the Pharaoh, the dragon again, who causes the Pharaoh, another nemesis, another antagonist, to enslave the protagonist, the nation of Israel. And we're going to look at that scenario and how it plays out when we look at it from the standpoint of really reading a book and knowing that there's only really one theme and only one conflict to the whole entire story. Now keep that in mind, because we're going to go to a break right now, but we'll be back and we're going to look at this to show you how specifically who Babylon the Great really is.
People tend to live with conflicting thoughts between their mental and emotional consciousness, and as a result, they end up blocking their own successes. In choosing one theme, Dr. Anthony Raimondo directs the reader to find truth and satisfaction in 2 easy steps, available at tapepublishing.com.
Doc is always in search of new original Christian music in all styles and genres to air on the show. He also loves to have guests on the show with exciting personal stories concerning a personal relationship with Christ. For more information, send an email to doc@docspeaksshow.com. If you would like a copy of Doc's book, Choosing One Theme, it is available at Amazon and Barnes & Noble. You can also visit our producer's website, acceleratingevolutionllc.com. Now back to the Doc Speaks Show.
We are back. I am Cyber Riva, your co-host, and this is the Doc Speaks Show on Intention Radio. I hope you like my new look, and here is Doc.
Thank you, Cyber Riva, for bringing us back. And this is the Doc Speaks Show on Intention Radio, and I'm the Doc. And today we're talking about the Lament over Fallen Babylon, and we're pointing out that it can't be a church of any kind. And anyone who is saying those things is a false teacher, because he's leading you or she's leading you in the wrong direction, and you will not be able to really recognize who the villains in the story are. Now we're going to go back, because I'm showing you how the end reflects the beginning. Now let's go back, and there's something else I want you to consider, and that's the firstborn. The firstborn, Cain, became a killer. And so that the promise goes to Seth rather than the firstborn. And we notice that Ishmael is a firstborn, but he's a firstborn of a slave woman. So he's not the promise. The younger brother is. When we look at Jacob is the younger brother of Esau. And Esau sells his birthright for a bowl of stew. So he gives it away. Now, in Exodus, God refers to Israel as his firstborn. And you can go look it up. You can go. I'm not going to do all the homework here. And you could look it up, and it'll say, my firstborn. So Israel is God's firstborn. But we've seen in the past that the firstborn makes mistakes, and then the younger brother ends up with the blessing. Now, when we get to look at the 12 tribes, well, Reuben and Simon, that's 1 and 2, they commit a murder, so they don't get the blessing. So it goes down to Judah, who's a younger brother. Then that brother, which is, now watch how interesting this is, that brother sells or proposes to sell an even younger brother into slavery. And so we have that going. Now, okay, we have a brother sells a younger brother, puts him into slavery, and he becomes, now watch who he becomes. He becomes the second man in charge of all the food in Egypt. The Pharaoh gives Joseph charge of all the food in Egypt, and if you don't get Joseph permission, you don't eat. So it's interesting that we have a Hebrew in charge of commodities in Egypt. And in Egypt, we get the plagues. Now let's go to Revelation. We're going to have someone in charge of the monetary system, money, eating, the whole 9 yards. And it's not going to be the church. The beast has to be someone like Joseph. Or the Pharaoh is Joseph. The The Pharaoh is in charge of everything, the beast of the sea. And a Joseph-type character, the beast of the earth, a Hebrew, a member of the 12 tribes, not a Catholic priest, not a pope, will be the number 2 man, who will assist in making sure that only the people with the mark of the beast will be able to eat. We have a mirror, a reflection going back. Okay? So now we have the dragon, who's the voice behind the snake. Some kind of a beast. We have Eve, who's the harlot. She's the first one to commit adultery in that she disobeys God. So we have a female image, the harlot, the prostitute of Babylon, the nation of Israel. Because you have to remember something, that this whole entire book is about only one group of people. This whole entire book is about God's relationship with the nation of Israel. So everything from beginning to end is about God's relationship with Israel and a nemesis, Satan, the dragon, who's constantly trying to prevent Israel, the protagonist, from developing into the kind of a nation that God, the other major character in the story, wants. However, we have here, and this is what people don't understand, we have here a sort of like a Greek tragedy. Because, you see, the protagonist in the story never really develops. The protagonist in the story never becomes the nation that God wants. If we read the story from cover to cover, and instead of looking at each book as a book, but a chapter in the book, you will see that the protagonist, the nation of Israel, fails constantly. No sooner is it out of Egypt, it's complaining. No sooner is it out of Egypt, it builds a golden calf as an idol. Long before Babylon has idols. It's not Rome. The story is about the nation of Israel and its love affair with God. And its love affair is a bad one because she's always cheating on God. She's a harlot. She's a prostitute. And that's why we see that in chapter 18. Now we're in chapter 19 of the story. Well, we're in chapter 19 in Revelation, but we're also in the last chapter of the saga. We could call it the last chapter of the episode of this big story, where now she's back. She's wearing fancy clothes. She's acting like she's a queen. She's dealing in all sorts of business with everybody. But she's committing all kinds of crimes. Now, another thing, okay, who was it that killed Christ? Who was it that killed the prophets? Who was it that killed the first Christians? The nation of Israel. Now we're going to be looking at the end part of the story is going to reflect the life in Egypt, because now come the plagues, and some of those plagues are identical. But what happens? What really happens to Egypt? Egypt is economically and militarily destroyed. Livestock is dead from all sorts of plagues. The locusts eat the grain. They're now in famine. They don't have anything to eat. Now, on top of that, God also reduces the workforce by killing off all firstborn. So now we got the workforce is depleted. And then finally, God destroys the Egyptian military. He's destroyed Egypt economically. So Egypt is in a state of lament. Egypt here is lamenting in Exodus. And now we have this revelation. And we have, before we get to that, the harlot, the children of the viper, as Jesus called them, has the Son of God killed. That's like this, because the child of God is born through an Israeli Judean bloodline, which makes Israel mommy. Now, mommy kills her son, and daddy's upset. Now, can you imagine? You're coming home and your wife kills your kid, and it's happened. We've seen it. Now, some people might use that statement to support the idea of pro-choice, pro-life, and not pro-choice. You're not killing my son. See, people forget that. Now, so they kill his son. And what happens? He destroys the temple, because you know why he destroys the temple? Because the temple becomes an idol. You say, wait a minute, that's the highest. They worship the temple. They sell goods in the temple as if it's the stock market. So he destroys the temple using the younger brother. Ooh, the Gentile is the younger brother in the story. The Gentile becomes the younger brother as the story unfolds. Because the older brother killed a brother, just like Cain killed Abel. You see? So we can look at Israel from the standpoint of a Cain, or as an Eve, as a harlot. Those are just monikers that we use to describe what's happening in the story. But when we look at the story from beginning to end, it's about Israel. It's about how she, because we're going to use the word she, but it could use the word he, is a terrible bride. And in fact, in Hosea, he gives Israel a divorce. Ooh. Israel's gotten divorce papers. Oh. So if Israel got divorce papers, is it possible he got another bride? That's right. A younger brother or a younger sister is now the bride. So you see, the church can't be the villain in the story. The church is a sub-character in the story. The church is someone else in there to fill in some of the spots, a sort of sub-theme in the story. But the main character is always God and Israel. Those are the main characters in the story, even though you see smaller characters. Because the smaller characters represent the two big characters. So now we're looking back, and now here we are in the end, and it's going to be a mirror image of Exodus, because instead of the Gentile nation being destroyed, God has finally had it with his former wife. God has finally had it with the harlot. he's given her, he's punished her for 2,000 years, and instead of turning back, and this is why it's taken 2,000 years, instead of turning back, she hasn't. She's done all sorts of things behind the scenes. She's possessed and went after money. Now, when we look at what they own Hollywood. Look at what Hollywood presents to people. Do you know that the same producers in Hollywood also own the pornographic industry? And often, if you look, some of the actors come out of the porn industry to be in the film industry. Stallone is one of them. There are many others. So we have that. We also have the media. Look at the way the media operates. Who owns the media? So we have this group of people who has drifted away from God, has caused and has constantly has seeked over millenniums to influence the Gentile nations into immorality. If they're the ones with the films, if they're the ones, look at what they do with the banks. They own all the major Federal Reserve banks of the world. So do they control nations? Yes. You see? So now, here we are in Revelation 18 talking about the lament and how these governments and these merchants are lamenting. They're crying. We're broke now, and because God now is going to do what he did to Egypt. He's going to destroy the wealth of people first. Because that's what the plagues do. Not only do they make people sick, but you're killing off animals, you're killing off crops. He's going to destroy the stock market. He's going to destroy how these people have been manipulating and gaining wealth all over. Now, here's an interesting thing for you. I don't know if you know this, but I believe it was Abraham. It could have been Jacob, but Abraham or Jacob, I have to go back and look at my notes, owned 60% of the wealth in his lifetime. Another Jew, Israeli, Hebrew, today, Rothschilds, his family owns over 50% of the wealth of the world. So we have, again, this mirror image of a character in the past resembling a character in the future. That's why we refer to John the Baptist as a reflection of Isaiah. So we have these mirror images that occur. It's probably why some people think they're reincarnated, because they're just mirror images of another character. And they think, I'm reincarnated. Yeah, okay. So, because you associate with someone in the past. So this is what we have. We now have this mirror image on how Israel is going to be like Egypt, and it's going to lose all of its wealth. And that's the lamenting. This is not a church that does business. Think about that for a moment. We're going to go to a break. We'll come back, and we're going to wrap it up.
People tend to live with conflicting thoughts between their mental and emotional consciousness, and as a result, they end up blocking their own successes. In choosing one theme, Dr. Anthony Raimondo directs the reader to find truth and satisfaction in 2 easy steps, available at tapepublishing.com.
We are back. I am Cyber Riva, your co-host, and this is the Doc Speak Show on Intention Radio. I hope you like my new look, and here is Doc.
Thank you, Cyber Riva, for bringing us back. And this is the Doc Speak Show on Intention Radio. And I'm the Doc, a voice that comes to you from the internet wilderness deep in cyberspace. And we're talking about the Lamenting of Babylon in chapter 18 of the book of Revelation. Now, in verse 4, here's an interesting clue. God says this, or actually, John hears another voice from heaven say, "Come out of her, my people, so that you will not share in her sins, so that you will not receive any of her plagues, for her sins have piled up to heaven, and God has remembered her crimes." Now, he's talking about my people. That's Israel. Israel has always been God's people from the very beginning. Because, again, we have to look at the whole book as one story. Each book within the book is a chapter in the saga, in the drama between God and Israel, the nation, his bride, who he divorces. Here, he goes, he hasn't forgotten her crimes. How often did she turn to idolatry? For example, now this might, and he talks about it even in the letters, about open prayer so people see you praying. That's not what he wanted. He wanted prayer in secret. And here today, we have people standing in front of a wall, praying to a wall. What's the wall, God? Your temple is really your God and not God? You've made the temple an idol, and that's why God destroys it. You see? So now here we are, the lamenting of. Now, Israel, the nation, over the last nearly 2,000 years, less, 1900, okay, has been a nation behind the scenes, and indirectly corrupting other nations, indirectly powering and lending money to other nations. It's been behind the scenes fornicating with the kings, lending and borrowing and taking and power and this and that. That's and people want to call that the Catholic Church. They're so wrong. Now, another interesting thing is that just like Joseph was the number 2 man to Pharaoh, so will be the false prophet the number 2 man for the Antichrist. I prefer to call them the beast of the sea and the beast of the earth, because that's what the Bible calls them. That's your number 1 man and your number 2 man, okay? And it could be a woman, but it's the number 1 man and the number 2 man. Number 1 position, number 2 position, okay? When we look at Scripture, you know what we find? We find 19 times there's been a prophet who has assisted a king or a pharaoh in Scripture. And those were the prophets that were killed. Those were the Hebrew Israeli prophets that were the number 2 man to the king. Samuel is the number 2 man to Saul. He then becomes the number 2 man to David. We see this picture all the time. It's constantly being repeated. So now here we are in the book of Revelations, and there's a number 1 man and a number 2 man. All over again. The number 1 man may not be a Jew, an Israelite, because neither was the Pharaoh. But Joseph was from the tribe of Jacob. The number 2 man, the beast of the earth, the lamb that I talked about in that show, will be from one of the tribes of Israel. It's happened 19 times before. So see, God is an interesting author, and he constantly repeats himself. Now, some people might not like writers who constantly repeat himself, but God constantly repeats himself. He constantly shows the thing over and over again. Why? Because he wants to reinforce this is what's going to happen. Reinforces this is what's going to happen. A number 1 and a number 2. A number 1 and a number 2. A number 1 and a number 2. We see it over and over and over again. We had Herod, a king, who wasn't a Jew. He was an Edomite. That means he was from he was a descendant of Esau, not Jacob. And then we have the Pharisees that were the church, the synagogue, that was also in political power. And the king and the Pharisees as a group, would make deals with the Romans. So we have this king and a prophet, the king. And now in that case, Caiaphas or Ananias may not have been very good prophets. They might have been not prophets at all. But it's the idea of a religious person supporting the political person. Today we have the Zionist Jew and the Talmud and the Torah Jew. The Zionist is more interested in politics, whereas the Torah Jew is interested in the faith. We have those two appearing again and again and again. So that's what we have here. So now we're looking at these two also become two political groups, which they are. And one of the things that we're going to see, we see here in Revelations 18, is that Babylon is doomed because it's actually going to kill itself. And here's where we get the idea behind the tragic hero. See, the tragic hero in the story is a protagonist, and a protagonist is supposed to evolve until finally overcoming conflict and being able to raise to a higher level. A tragic hero, on the other hand, is someone who indirectly ends up, through his own faults, kills himself. Because he doesn't take the time to consider what's going on in the story. You see, most people think that that Romeo and Juliet are the tragic heroes in that particular Shakespearean story. But the reality is the families are the protagonists in the story because they're at war with each other. And their two children, their son and their daughter, dies because of their hatred for one another. So in the end, they're tragic heroes. They lost their child out of their own stupidity. So that's what we see here in the final part here with the Babylonian princess who thinks she's a queen, actually, when in fact she's the harlot. She wants to strut around. Now what happens is this. We're going to see, because she rides the beast and then eventually the beast eats her. So we have two political powers and one's going to devour the other. And Jesus makes that statement that a house divided will fall, and Israel will become a house divided and it will fall. And they're looking at building a third temple, and that third temple will be destroyed as well before God comes to earth. Now you say, no, it won't. Oh, yes, it will, because God's going to destroy the whole entire world. In fact, God's going to bring his temple, which is in heaven, down to earth. So he won't need a temple made by man's hands when he has a temple made by his own hands. So we're going to see that even the third temple will be destroyed. One, it happened once, it may never happen again. Two, if it happens twice, it'll probably happen a third time. We have that scenario going. Because why do you want this temple? You see, the temple is where you want to worship. The temple is what you're worshiping indirectly. And God will destroy that temple. And it's going to happen. It's going to happen because God has had enough with his prostituting wife. He's also had enough with his number one offspring, and he's already gone to a number two offspring. The number two offspring are the Gentiles who believe in his son through faith, like Abraham. The Gentile who believes in Jesus through faith becomes like Abraham, because Abraham believed in God through faith. So the Gentile becomes the number two son because he's faithful. Israel sold its birthright by turning to idol worship. It sold its birthright by turning to money and wealth and power. It's not the Catholic Church. It's not any church. And anyone who preaches that is preaching a false doctrine, because you don't know who the villains are in the story. And we know who the villain is. The villain is the dragon, Satan. Satan is the villain, without a doubt. He's the nemesis. His job in the story, his character role in the story, is to make sure that Israel never becomes a holy bride. And he's done that. He's also working at everybody else not being righteous. Israel is Eve, who is constantly tempted by Satan to looking at the grass is greener on the other side. 30 days, Moses is gone maybe 30 days. They're already building a statue to idol. It happens all the time. When we look at the book from cover to cover and read it like one story, instead of picking and choosing little verses to present a false doctrine, taking one sentence out of a whole chapter and saying, oh, look what happens. No, let's read the whole book as a story between several characters. And then we really start to see what's going on in the story. The story has always been between God and a particular bloodline. And that particular bloodline becomes the nation of Israel. Then the nation of Israel becomes a major character in the story as a person, as if you're talking about a person, a woman. She then is the character that goes throughout the rest of the story. Now, yes, we have other little characters, individuals, but those individual characters are to give us a view of what's going on between God and that major character, the protagonist. The antagonist in the story is the nemesis, who's constantly trying to destroy the protagonist. And the protagonist, in the end, we see, becomes a tragic hero and destroys itself. That's the overall story here. So it can't be somebody else. We didn't introduce another character and say, okay, from now on, this is the story. No. It's only one novella. It's only one soap opera. It began with Adam and Eve and God, and it's going to end in the end, overcoming the conflict that started in the garden. And what was that conflict? The separation of man and God. By whom? By the evil serpent, the dragon, who is the villain in the story. At some point, there has to be a resolution to that particular situation. Now, yes, some of the people will turn, some of the Hebrews, some of the Jews will turn to Christ. Just like some of the Gentiles have turned to Christ. Not everybody. So the resolution in the story is those who have turned to Christ and who have stayed fast and have listened to his word and have faith in him, the Son, and in the Father, and in the Holy Spirit. The others are the tragic heroes who refuse to accept and listen to the nemesis, the antagonist in the story, and always follow the lead of Satan, just as Eve did in the beginning of the story. So the beginning of the story and the ending of the story reflect each other. That's what's happening in this drama that we call the Bible. One big drama with many episodes. You know, like a season run of a novella. We have all these we have episodes. Each little book with a different title is another episode in the overall story. And characters seem to do the same things, similar things as the story progresses. Like I said, we got a number of prophets who support a leader. In the end, we're going to have a prophet, false one, support another leader. The same thing. Who's going to be that false prophet? Well, somebody from the same place as the others. That's it, folks. When you look at the story from beginning to end as one entire story with one theme, one concept, conflict, one nemesis, one antagonist, which is the same thing, and one protagonist, the nation of Israel. And then you're going to watch and you read what happens with these characters. Now, there are subordinate characters, those who follow Jesus. But the first ones to follow Jesus were Jewish. They were Jewish. Paul is a Jew. Luke is not a Jew, he's Greek. But John is a Jew. James is a Jew. Matthew, Mark, they're all Jewish. The first people to accept Christ are Jewish. They were the ones who saw and believed. They were the ones who were the protagonists in the story that evolved. The others are the tragic heroes who refuse to listen because they've listened to the dragon or the harlot. And the harlot in Jesus' time was the synagogue, was the Pharisees, was the Sadducees. They were the ones who were divorced by God. Read the Bible from cover to cover. Really look at the story. And don't listen to some false prophet as to who and what certain characters are. And tune in again to our next chapter when we deal with chapter 19 of the book of Revelations. Until then, God bless.
This has been another enlightening episode at www.intentionradio.com. Stay tuned for more.